Once again, we'd like to wish everyone a good morning. Welcome you to the service here that we have on the Lord's Day when we gather together to offer praises to God by way of singing and prayer and Bible study and observing the Lord's Supper. All these items are essential methods by which we worship God. And we appreciate everyone's presence and your participation as we do this together. We're also trying to take the first steps toward getting our sermons on video on the internet. And if you pick up a bulletin, there's a little banner there that shows how to reach the videos that are recorded. If you have any questions, just get in touch with me and I'll be glad to help with that. One thing that we run across in our world today is that sometimes people have different views about God, but we know that nobody can know anything about God unless it is revealed to us. And Paul the Apostle writes about this in 1 Corinthians, the 2nd chapter. He tells us, "For what man knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things that have been freely given to us by God." Well, what Paul is telling Christians there is that what we know of God is what he has revealed to us. That's the basic idea. And since God has revealed himself to us through his Word, that should be our standard for how we understand God and what he is and how he works and what kind of things he does. But unfortunately, in the world of today, people hold many different ideas about what God is. I'm just going to put some pictures up here, and I'm not sure why the screen is a little smaller than usual, but this illustrates some people's idea about what God is and how he operates. Some view God, like this picture here, as a cosmic being of some sort that is out there in the universe, but it's a cosmic force of some kind that somehow has an influence on us. I've got the wrong picture here. Now, here we go. Others in today's world may think of God as kind of like the old man in the sky picture, someone who's up there but is congenial toward us, a benevolent father figure of some kind, whose job is to only make us feel good, maybe. Others may see God in terms of human endeavor. Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism have a view of God that might appear like something that came from man's imagination. We do see that sometimes. Some view God as only a destructive force, that God is the one who brings punishment and destruction upon things in the world. We hear people during hurricane season sometimes wondering why God sent a hurricane somewhere. Well, that's an erroneous view of God, but that's what some folks think. We also find many times a view of God that represents the finger from heaven, something from heaven that indicates or points out to us things we should be doing or things we should change, and that might be a way to think about God, because he does direct our activities through the Scriptures. We also may think of God, many people do, as just the light, the source of all light, and that's where we turn our attention. So all of these things are what people's ideas involve concerning God. I propose that we study together this morning some things that God is not. Maybe that would be the way to approach it. Look at it from the more negative standpoint. What kind of things is God not like that people may be thinking today, and perhaps some of us, if we want to make our impression of God really a scriptural one, we might want to think about these things. For example, one thing that God is not is that God is not a man. Now you might think, well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it, that God is not a man? But yes, there are folks in the world who view God as some kind of a human-type entity with feelings and intentions and characteristics that are like men today. But we understand from what the Scriptures teach us, this, like we saw earlier, which Paul writes has been revealed to us by God himself, that God is not a man. In Numbers chapter 23, we find a passage there that tells us one way that God is not a man. He's not like a man in the sense that he keeps his word, when we know that men do not. In Numbers 23, verse 19. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? Well, we think about that. Men sometimes don't follow these precepts. Men make promises and don't keep them. Human beings are those who should repent at times, that we have done things that we should not. But God is not like that. God keeps his word. How's that important today? Well, if we are serious Bible students, we'll understand that God, when he speaks through the scriptures to us, will indeed keep this word. It's not an option. It's not a possibility or a probability that God will do something. If he says it, it will come to pass. And that's a way that God is not like men. He's also not like a man in that God does not think or act like we do. And this is where many folks in the world today get off track with God. We begin to think of God as behaving like a person would, weighing certain evidence and coming out with a decision like a person would do. And believe me, our logic as humans is not the same as God's logic. God's logic is different from ours. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 55, we read there from the words of this prophet, speaking as God would speak to us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." What does that tell us? Well, it tells us pretty much what we already came across earlier, and that is that God is not like us. He does not act or think like we do. And more so, it's foolish to try to bring God down to our level. I think that's the intention sometimes of folks in the world who are not really on board with doing God's will. They want to make God like people, and we can influence people. You know, we do it all the time. How do you influence somebody? You have to know what is important to them, how to say something in a way that will influence someone's judgment of you. But God is not a man in that he's not going to fall for that. God does not think or act like we do. And it's foolish to try to think that God might be like that. We also know that God is not a respecter of persons. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think about it, one of the ways that we operate as human beings is we do, in fact, appear to be respecters of persons at times. In our system of society, in our system of personal interactions, we do place people here or here or here, depending on order of importance. Sadly, that's the case. We know that we should not be, because God isn't a respecter of persons. But in many ways, humans operate like that. And so that means that many times folks think that God is a respecter of persons too. That he will put me somewhere on his scale of importance based on my being a good person. How good I am will fit me into God's scheme of things differently than somebody else. How hard a worker am I? That might fit me into a different place in God's plan. But we know that the scriptures teach us something different. Take as an example when Peter went to the household of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Peter was a Jew, and he'd been taught all his life that Gentiles were not to be approached. They were unclean. They were not people that you want to even be around. And then this vision comes to Peter, in which the Lord proclaims to him that now there is nothing unclean, and you should not view anybody that way. The Lord showed Peter a vision about how unclean foods were something that he should not be concerned about now. And he should translate that to going to see a Gentile. Cornelius was a Gentile. And Peter was sent to him to preach the gospel to him and his family. Peter may have had this thought in his mind, well, they're Gentiles. I should not be having anything to do with them. But God had taught Peter something different. And he says this, Peter does, when he begins to preach at Cornelius' household. Peter opened his mouth and said, "In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation Whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. What's Peter saying there? He's teaching us something too. And when he says God shows no partiality, then in order to be children of God and imitate him, we shouldn't either. Should show no partiality, no ranking of people in importance by anything about them, and we should furthermore do those things that are necessary for acceptance. I'm sorry, I got off track there. Give me just a moment to try to get back. Here we are. God accepts those who do certain things, not those who are a certain rank or have some kind of privilege. God accepts those who fear him and work righteousness. So that should be our goal. We want God to accept us. But it won't be based on, some system of ranking or character building or something like that. It's going to be based on our actions. How much do we fear God? How well do we work righteousness? That's the goal that we have. In the religious world, there's a teaching known as Calvinism, brought about by John Calvin back in the 1600s. And John Calvin had this whole system of religion. Part of it was based on exactly what we're talking about here, that God is a respecter of persons. One of the tenets of Calvinism is what's called unconditional election or predestination. And what that means is that God has already chosen individuals who will be saved or lost. And regardless of what they do and how they behave, they have been selected to be saved or lost based on that. Well, this is an untrue statement. Calvinism has no basis for that in the Scriptures. Even what we read from Peter's statement there in Acts chapter 10 shows that that's just not right. God does not respect persons, and if he has already chosen some to be saved and some to be lost, then that's a false tenet right there, a false assumption. What we should do then is to exercise our choice to work for God and know that Calvinism or anything connected with that is a definite no. It's not how God is. In the other picture of it, you and I have a choice. We can decide how to behave, how to serve God or not, whether to fear him and work righteousness or not. God has not singled you or me out for salvation or for eternal destruction. We make that choice ourselves, and that's how we're different from God. So God is not a respecter of persons. Let's move on with this a little bit. God is also not unaware of our lives. It is a thought sometimes among people today that God is so far removed from us. He's an entity, yes, maybe, but he doesn't really care about us. And sometimes even Christians begin to feel that maybe God is not aware of what's happening in our lives. That perhaps God is leading us on our own to deal with situations that come up in our lives. You can turn this around and say it in a more positive way and say that God is intimately aware of our lives. He knows and he's aware of all the things going on with us. In fact, in Psalm 33, the psalmist David wrote this: "The Lord looks from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From the place of his dwelling, he looks on all the inhabitants of the earth. He fashions their hearts individually, and he considers all their works." God does know. He's not unaware of what's happening in my life and yours. God knows about those things. And because he knows about them, he gives us assurance about what to do. Oh, we're not saying that God miraculously enters our head and talks to us. That's not how God communicates now. In the days of the Christian age, now we have the Bible. And that's how God creates a communication line with us. But he does know who we are, and he knows what we do. In Proverbs 15 and verse 3, great wise Solomon tells us, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good." Well, I'm impressed by that, because what that tells me is that God knows no matter what we're doing, good or evil. Now, In some ways, that's a comforting thought, isn't it? If we are doing good, then it's comforting to know that God's aware of that. He's aware of what we're doing. If we're diligently trying to be obedient to God, He's aware of it. But that's also kind of a horrifying realization if we're doing evil. If we're not doing what God says, then we also are told here He keeps watch on the evil as well. God knows about that. He knows, and since He knows, He also is the one who will judge us. In fact, that's another point we should keep in mind, that God knows and is aware of what we're doing, but He also is the one who will judge us based on that. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13, a very familiar passage to Bible students. The writer here says, "And there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account." No hiding from God. No getting away from His gaze at all. But more so, He is the one to whom we must give account. If we don't realize that, then we've missed the point about God. God expects us to operate and behave in a way that is according to His Word, so that as He requires us to give account of ourselves, we can do so in an acceptable way. We will be able to do that successfully. The picture here is that God is aware of our lives and knows exactly what and how we are doing things. Something else that God is not, though, is He's not out to get me. Have you ever heard someone say, "I don't want to get involved with God. I don't believe in God. I don't want the concept in my life because I don't want some far-off, distant deity out there waiting for me to make a mistake so He can get me"? I've heard people say that. How true is that? Is God the one who is kind of like watching for a mistake so He can come and get us? Well, how do we reconcile this? God is not out to get me. The Scriptures don't teach us that. The prophet Micah writes about how the Lord is one who is willing to be merciful to us. Let's take a look at that in Micah chapter 7, verse 18. "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity, and passing over the transgression of the remnant of His heritage? He does not retain His anger forever, because He delights in mercy." The God that we know and that we serve is not one who's waiting for us to make a boo-boo and then come and get us. God is one who is pardoning our iniquity. He doesn't retain anger forever. God is long-suffering, other passages tell us. So when we think about that, nothing could be further from the truth than to say God is waiting for us to make an error so He can punish us. It's not that way at all. Let's take a closer look at this, though. God, who is merciful and forgiving, is also one who doesn't take any joy in seeing evil punished. If God gained some kind of malevolent joy from punishing evil, that wouldn't be good for us, because the more we sin and do bad things, God would be joyful about that. That's not the way it works. We know from Ezekiel chapter 33 that God's attitude is different. Ezekiel 33 and verse 11, the Scripture says, "Say to them, as I live, says the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn from your evil ways, for why should you die, O house of Israel?"